In the late summer of 1666, London was a city waiting to die. It was a medieval labyrinth of timber and pitch, where houses leaned across narrow alleys so close that neighbors could shake hands from opposite windows. The city was exhausted. It had just survived the Great Plague of the previous year, which had claimed nearly a quarter of its population. The graveyards were full and the survivors were weary. Now, a long, hot summer had turned the wooden metropolis into tinder. A 10-month drought had dried the soil to dust, and the wooden buildings were seasoned and brittle. The warehouses by the river were bursting with oil, tallow, spirits, and hemp. All it took was a single spark to turn this fuel into a catastrophe. That spark fell shortly after midnight on Sunday, September 2nd, in a bakery on Pudding Lane owned by Thomas Farriner, the King's baker. Farriner claimed he had extinguished his ovens, but embers smoldered in the dark. By 2 a.m., the house was an inferno. Farriner and his family escaped by climbing out of an upstairs window into a neighbor's house, but their maid was too terrified to cross the gap. She remained behind, becoming the first victim of a tragedy that would consume the city. In the early hours, few were concerned. Fires were common in London, a hazard of daily life. When the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was summoned from his sleep to inspect the scene, he was unimpressed. He famously looked at the flames and dismissed them with a coarse remark, saying, "A woman might piss it out," before returning to bed. It was a fatal error of judgment. The standard method of fighting fire was demolition, pulling down houses to create a gap, but Bloodworth worried about the cost of reimbursing the owners. His hesitation allowed the fire to take hold. A strong easterly gale had picked up, and it began to drive the fire into the heart of the city with terrifying speed. By morning, the fire was no longer a local accident, it was a firestorm. The wind acted like a bellows, feeding oxygen to the flames, which jumped from roof to roof, traveling faster than a man could run. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, whose journals provide us with the most vivid account of the disaster, walked to the Tower of London and looked out over the city. He described an infinite great fire in a malicious arc of flame over a mile long. He saw pigeons hovering about their windows until they burned their wings and fell down. The panic was immediate. Citizens didn't try to fight the fire, they tried to outrun it. The River Thames became clogged with boats as people desperately loaded their belongings, furniture, musical instruments, and gold to escape the heat. Pepys himself famously buried his most prized possessions in his garden to save them: his papers, his wine, and a wheel of Parmesan cheese. Monday brought hell on earth. The fire grew so hot that it created its own weather patterns. The narrow streets acted as chimneys, sucking in air and blasting heat upwards. The noise was deafening, described by witnesses as the sound of 1,000 iron chariots crashing on the stones. The most terrifying moment came on Tuesday when the flames reached St. Paul's Cathedral. For centuries, the massive stone cathedral had been the spiritual center of London. People had filled its crypts and naves with their goods, believing the stone walls and the sacred ground would protect them. The Stationers' Company had stacked the crypts floor to ceiling with books and manuscripts, assuming them safe. They were wrong. The scaffolding around the cathedral caught fire, and the heat ignited the timber roof. The books in the crypt fueled the fire from below. The lead roof of St. Paul's began to melt. Witnesses described a horrifying scene where rivers of molten lead poured down the streets like lava, the pavement glowing red hot, blocking firefighters from even approaching. The great roof collapsed, and the history of medieval London crashed down with it. By now, the king, Charles II, had overridden the incompetent mayor. The king and his brother, the Duke of York, personally joined the bucket lines, their faces blackened with soot, passing water and handling axes alongside commoners.
But water was useless against this beast. The only way to stop the fire was to starve it. They began using gunpowder to blow up entire rows of houses, creating fire breaks, gaps in the urban fabric that the flames could not jump across. The sound of explosions added to the terror, leading some to believe the city was being invaded by the French or Dutch. Finally, on Wednesday, the wind died down. The demolition of buildings had worked. The fire had burned itself out, but the silence that followed was deafening. The devastation was absolute. In just 4 days, the fire had consumed 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, the Royal Exchange, and St. Paul's Cathedral. 4/5 of the city lay in ash. From the Temple in the west to the Tower in the east, London was a smoking wasteland where the ground remained too hot to walk on for days. Remarkably, the official death toll recorded only a handful of people, though modern historians believe many deaths of the poor went unrecorded, their bodies entirely incinerated by the crematorium-level heat.
In the aftermath, the city looked for someone to blame. Paranoia was rampant. A simple-minded French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire, claiming to be an agent of the Pope. Despite evidence that he wasn't even in London when the fire started, he was hanged, a victim of grief and xenophobia. Yet, from the ashes, a new London arose. The task of rebuilding fell to the brilliant architect Sir Christopher Wren. While his grandest plans for a geometrically perfect city were rejected due to property disputes, he succeeded in rebuilding 51 churches and the magnificent new St. Paul's Cathedral that stands today. To commemorate the disaster, Wren also designed the Monument, a massive Doric column that still stands today. If you were to lay it flat, it would reach exactly from its base to the site of the bakery on Pudding Lane. The new city was built of brick and stone, not wood. Streets were widened. It was the birth of modern London and, inadvertently, the birth of the modern insurance industry, as men realized they needed protection against such total loss. The Great Fire destroyed medieval London, but it cleared the ground for the global metropolis of the future.